Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lilia McEnany, and I'm an assistant curator at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture Laboratory of Anthropology. For those of you who are familiar with MIAC and our programming know that pre-pandemic, we regularly hosted pottery demonstrations at our Bucksbaum Gallery. And even though we are still now open to the public, we are continuing our pottery demonstration series and all other programming via Zoom for the time being. So before we start talking with Jared, a few things. To begin, I would like to briefly acknowledge the place where this conversation is happening, even though we are not physically at the museum today, in Okopoge within the Tewa world. As a non-native person living in so-called Santa Fe, I am a guest in the ancestral homelands of the Tewa communities. And I wish to acknowledge all of the indigenous people, Pueblo, Diné, Apache, and so many others, past, present, and future, who walk on these lands and steward this place. And I would encourage everybody watching here today to reflect on their own position to the lands on which they reside. So with that, thank you again for everybody's patience with the technical difficulties, and I'll hand it over to Jared.
Everyone. Belagana Nishlo, Naki the net Whitelini, but it's team, Belagana Dashe, Ado, Lokat the net Dashinella, Nahadetil a Nasha, the Nebehash Klishitsa, Ashi, Ado, the Nebeza, the Yashke Bohosha, Akote, the net Nishle. Everyone, thanks for coming. I am currently in Nahadetil, Arizona, which is just south from Sanders, Arizona. It's also known as the Newlands. This is where I am residing now. So welcome everybody. Today with pottery demonstration and instruction, I wanted to cover some of the ways that I approach making pottery and some of the things that I think about. All my process is hand-built, coil-built, stone polished, as well as I source my clay from different places, whether it's in New Mexico, Arizona. I've even got some stuff from Washington State. Today, the clay that I'm working with is a mixture of several of those. It's kind of a reclaimed bucket, a recycled bucket, since I save all my scraps and all the different properties from different clays kind of mixed together and complement one another. So it's a very good elastic type of clay. So I'm gonna go through process and making. I'm gonna be, one thing that I want to have as a through line through this conversation is I'm gonna be cautious how I use the word traditional. During my MFA at UNM, which I recently finished this December and had my thesis show at King's Gallery in Santa Fe, I often contemplated or challenged the traditional definitions of what tradition means and what that definition is based off of different audiences. So with that, I'll go ahead and start showing you some of my process. I usually have a couple variety of ribs, shaping ribs. These are conventional ceramics ribs. You can use traditionally gourds, pieces of gourds that are smooth, smooth stones or rocks, twigs or sticks. One of the biggest traditional tool that mirrors this, I don't know if you can see with clarity, it is a rib that has a serrated edge. The traditional equivalent for this is a corn cob without the kernels, which also I often use because it leaves a really beautiful organic texture. So sometimes I use that with my clay. I have some polishing stones that I use to refine my process, which I can go to refine the surface. I can go into more detail as I start forming a vessel. A lot of times in Southwest pottery or native pottery, there is a shallow bowl that is used to form the base. You can kind of use any bowl. Plaster works great because it pops out really often. One thing that I've been really considering is the bottom shape of the vessel that I'm creating. There is this kind of unwritten rule that all of the surfaces that our pots interact with are flat. So there's this kind of interaction that occurs. And I think a lot about the angles and the volume that that shape of that pot holds at that contact point. So I've actually been straying away from using these and starting my vessels with pinch pots. So I have a little bit more control of those angles. My undergraduate degree, I pursued electrical engineering. So and oddly enough, sometimes the math and physics of things really influence how I think about pots when I'm making them. Sometimes it's hard to explain, but I hope to be able to one day articulate that really well. So to go ahead and start, I have a prepped piece of clay. One thing to always do with your clay when you're starting clay, it's always important to wedge. There's a couple different ways to wedge. The way that I'm going to show today is called a spiral wedge. And this has become muscle memory just from my experience at UNM with the Arita porcelain class, which is a Japanese technique from Arita, Japan. That is a one-of-a-kind program that's come to the University of New Mexico. With wedging, this style, one hand kind of dominates the pressure, while the other one kind of scoops and rotates. And so you get a spiral wedge occurring. This is really important to mix your clay ahead of time. Clay under a microscope looks like little platelets stacked on top of one another. So it's really important to align those things, those platelets as you, before you work with your clay. First, I'll start with a smaller piece of clay, something that's manageable. It also depends on how I'm going to start. So in this particular time, I'm going to start with a pinch pot and build up from there, rather than using a shallow bowl made of plaster. Another thing that I've been doing, since I've been also trained for kind of classic ceramic techniques of wheel thrown stoneware, I've been customizing, making my own bowls. I might be able to grab a few later to show some examples, just so that I have more control of how the bottom of the vessel interacts with the later form that you create. So that's been a big thought process of mine of how the bottom of the vessel really impacts the character or the overall form of the pot that you create. So start with a small ball. Usually people tell you to roll it into a ball first, but I kind of make a flat version. It's easier to get my thumbs into the clay, press my thumb into the center of the clay, pinch and rotate. One thing that you'll know, or you might realize with a lot of native pottery or pottery from a lot of different tribes, is coil building really combines the technique of a pinch pot and coils, rather than most Western or kind of European or American in terms of the USA type of ceramics. They teach to roll a lot of coils and slip and score and stack them, which I have thought of that means there's a need of a lot of consistency in your coils. There's a lot of joints for stacking each coil, so you have more risk, a higher risk of breakage, or one of those joints where you've attached clay failing. And as well as combining that pinch pot technique with your coils helps compress all of those seams. But ultimately, the number of coils needed in a pot is a fraction of what you would be taught or you would learn in a traditional ceramics course that you would take in high school or at a university. So right now I'm starting to open up this vessel. I'm establishing the thickness first at the bottom and pinching this thicker mass of clay up for height. I'm trying to consider what the size of the foot or the base of this vessel is going to be in relation to the form that I've been wanting to create. Recently, I've been wanting to do really elongated forms, taller forms that are sometimes a little more narrow. Kind of always inspired from those classic Navajo forms, those classic Navajo drums or cooking pots. I've always seen them or been inspired by them as a classic, timeless shape. As well as there's a lot of versatility that you can create with that general form, whether you elongate it or you put a flare at the lip at the end, or how much volume you give in the belly. There's a lot of nuance where you can have a very long conversation with that form. A lot of this pinching requires a sense of touch, really thinking about what the pressure of your thumbs and your fingers are doing and how the clay is reacting. So I'm just working on getting some height from this shape, trying to flare it out just a little bit so I can have a more voluminous form when I add coils to this shape on the bottom. One thing that I've also been doing more and more is I've been wanting to shrink the foot smaller and smaller. Or the idea, which I don't know how possible it would be, is how could you create a pot that it kind of defeats or fools the viewer that how is it standing up by itself because the foot is so small compared to the rest of the vessel. I think it can add some very elegant qualities to the piece, as well as kind of looking at the limit of how small of a foot can you put on that vessel without it being too unstable or rocky. I think that one of the inspirations for that is how earlier I talked about the shape of the bottom of the vessel interacting with the bottom or with a flat surface, and how a lot of our traditional vessels were completely round on the bottom, which then asks the question, how do you set that pot down? A lot of times they're stored upside down, or the purpose of the rounded bottom is that it handles the heat well. When you're cooking with it or burying it in a bed of coals, that there are no corners involved. So at this stage, usually I'll transfer this to what is called a banding wheel, which kind of helps control, gives consistency in my process, as well as that I don't get too preoccupied making one pot, whether I'm balancing it in my lap. It also gives it time where I can put this pot down, because if the clay needs to stiffen up a little bit before I add the next layer or the next coil, I give it that time to stiffen up so it doesn't sag on itself, which is the reason why using these shallow bowls are so important, is that you can make your vessel rather quickly, and you don't have to wait for the bottom part of the clay to stiffen up to support itself. That's what the bowl is doing. A lot of clay and making pottery really requires a lot of patience and understanding where your mind is while you're working. If you're stressed, if you feel like you need to rush your work, if emotionally you're not in a good place, that's going to reflect in your work. Whether the clay is not going to work with you while you're making, or those feelings that you are feeling or that impatience you're feeling in the process will manifest in somehow later in the process, whether that be warping, that be shrinking, or cracking while it dries, or even cracking in the firing. There are things you can do to mitigate that by adding a temper. A lot of times people will use volcanic, like the volcanic ash as a form as a temper. I've made the transition away from that, and I've been using a volcanic basalt. So it's more of a rocky texture. I get it from an area called Shadow Mountain near Tuba City, Arizona, which then I grind up to make into a fine powder to add to my clay. Which in this stage, that's the only stage that I work with a dry powder, which I can elaborate on later on as I start to refine the surface. So right now, I'm using a sponge. You can use a cloth that's kind of bunched up to support the inside of the wall, as I use a serrated rib to scrape the outside surface of this vessel. So I'm doing this because this serrated rib leaves a very distinct pattern. There are little teeth on there. I think these are a little bigger. You might be able to see those teeth. It's hard to see. So that has a high point and a low point. So essentially what's going on is you're forcing the clay through 2 points, rather than you have this very large range of highs and lows from your fingerprints. There's a huge variety, but when you do this, it forces them through 2. It also leaves a very distinct pattern where you can see those low points very easily and those high points very easily. So I scrape the clay until I can see that there's no more markings. This can take quite a bit of time. Sometimes you can get in a very, almost like a trance or a rhythm, where it can be very therapeutic, where you're just kind of scraping and really getting into the zone. Typically, I scrape the inside first. I have a tendency, or at least early on, I had a tendency that if the outside of the pot looked really pretty, then I could just kind of neglect the inside. And so I made the decision to first refine the inside of the vessel, so that once the outside is later refined, I don't have to go back and do the inside. But for today's purpose, I'm going to just do the outside for sake of time. I can always go back and refine the inside.
Jared, would you be able to take some questions right now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we have one question about the role of the shapes of your vessels, and it's the relationship between shape and form and use and purpose.
Shape and forms directly has a direct connection to the end function. So for example, I make coffee mugs out of micaceous clay, and what I think about with the shape of the coffee mug or the handle is, first off, the volume. And the volume's the most important, because you don't want to have this beautiful mug that only holds 4 ounces of coffee or tea, as well as you don't want too much volume to where you have 20 ounces of coffee that gets cold before you can finish it. So those are some of the things that I consider. It goes the same way with traditional vessels, for if they're used in ceremony or in specific ceremonies, the size of the vessel is already kind of standardized. Another thing that I consider is I've been making like boiling vessels for wool dyes, adding color to wool, and considering the size of that vessel and the shape of that vessel. How is it going to keep the heat in the moisture? Do you actually need a big opening to dip the wool in? And just kind of those considerations. A lot of it's trial and error when it's coming to function. With the shape of vessels for something that's more decorative, where I want to contribute to the kind of more the conversation of what now pottery is and what it will be, and inspire other potters to think about form. Is in that scenario, I do a lot of sketching and I draw a lot of forms. The shape and the form that I've kind of first started, and how the rules that I thought about is that when I draw a silhouette of a pot, it is a 2D form, which is usually really easy to, this is where it pulls back to engineering and I get a little bit of nerdy, is that you can define those curves mathematically. And those curves, there's continuity in the curves and the derivatives of, if you called that pot a function, or if you look at like a parabola, those type of things. I thought about that a lot, of having continuous curves, and how there's kind of a rule that you can kind of go by, thinking about the function of the curvature of the outside of the vessel. And then if you've ever taken a calculus course, there's a correlation between kind of the surface area of a pot, and as that changes with the shape, so does the rate of change of the volume also changes. So that's another thing that I consider with making pots, especially when I'm thinking about volume, that last bit. Because the void that's inside the pot can sometimes be really overlooked. It's a quality that can really bring life or a conversation to a pot. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so this last bit, usually sometimes I'll refine as I go. So I'll go over with the smooth rib after I've gotten these kind of smooth vertical lines from that serrated rib. But for this case, I'm going to smooth them all later once I add some coils. So another tool that's really important. One second, I've got to pull it out of my toolbox. Because I had one out, but I hid it somewhere. Okay, I'm gonna have to make this one work. This is a tool that has a small little ball at the end, which is great for incising or carving, but it is sharp enough that I can use to do a rough cut. So right now, any variability or asymmetry in that initial form I made, and as well as exactly where I punched that first initial kind of hole with my thumb, if I pinch consistency, all those variabilities go to the top, so you get a inconsistent lip. And so before I add my next coil, I always cut this even, so that when I add the coil, it gives me a little more control. Because if all the different heights from you look at different parts of the pot, if they grow at different heights, it's going to be more difficult to control the shape or the form. So I'll do that and then kind of pinch the rim to almost a point to kind of prep the next coil that I will add to the shape. One thing you got to also consider is I put this clay directly on this banding wheel. And so you might get some suction. Sometimes some people put like a napkin down, a piece of cloth, or even a piece of paper so that it will peel off later. So again, I'm gonna grab another piece of clay. Every time you add clay to a vessel, it's really important to wedge your piece of clay. You cannot understand or underestimate the power of wedging. So this is where I roll out coils. One thing to consider, so because I roll my coils thick, I'll usually kind of form them into a coil first. So it's a little easier to roll out because sometimes it can be a lot of clay. When people start rolling coils, they put a lot of weight down on their hands. They do a lot of pressure, which is not necessary. If you let the motion and the roll and just the weight of your hands and the clay itself, that's how you get a universal or a uniform coil, rather than if you look at the cross section of the coil, it becomes an oval and almost washboardy. Then you want to make sure you're rolling the full length of the outside of the coil, so you're not just rolling half of it. And then before I add this coil, one trick that I've always thought about is how the circumference of a pot is equal to the diameter times pi. So I look at the diameter of where I'm going to attach the coil. That's my length. Pi is 3.14. So I have my coil about 3 times that length. I don't worry about the 0.14 remainder because I cradle my coil slightly on the inside. So I don't stack my coils on top of one another. It sits slightly on the inside. So here's the thickness of my coil. And I will start to attach this. We'll see how well this bottom wall holds the shape or holds the weight of this clay. That's also another deciding factor that will determine how thick of a coil you can add, is the weight on the bottom wall. I let the coil overlap slightly where I attached it, and I'll blend it together. And then on the outside of this seam, I'll blend from the bottom wall up, and then the other part of the coil, I'll blend down. I'm kind of blending and pinching at the same time. That is one thing that I've kind of, a muscle memory that I've developed. And then similar to if you have training in classic ceramics, or where you are using a wheel to throw your clay, an electric wheel or a kick wheel or something of that nature. It's the same kind of concept where you grab clay at the bottom and you pull it for height. So you're moving this mass of clay up. That's how I'm kind of treating this coil. It's thick. I pinch to thickness, the thickness of the wall that I want, and that's how I get a lot of height out of one coil. I'm a big believer that as a potter or a ceramicist, that to learn as many techniques as you can, that they don't have to be necessarily quote unquote traditional clay or traditional processes, to learn how to throw, to learn how a kiln works, because all that knowledge contributes to your overall fluency with clay. Really understanding in depth how this material works and how it'll react. And I think clay is a relationship that you constantly have to nourish, and those are ways that you can kind of nourish your style of clay. So just kind of the thought process of learning how to throw on the wheel, there were some subtleties that clicked in terms of sense of touch that has also impacted how I pinch, or how I think of what actually is going on here. How to mitigate the number of variables that are going on, so I only have to focus on one. It's easier to control that way. So just pinching and thinking about the indents, the impressions that my fingers leave. And it's coming up on 10:40. So I'm gonna pause on this vessel and bring in some other ones that I've made that are in the process to talk about some of the next steps. So this is how I generally form the shape. And
Jared, we have a question while you were working on that piece. We have a question about the walls specifically and how you determine how thick to pinch them.
So I have a lot of it's muscle memory. I don't even think about it. So I pinched usually a 1/4 inch or less, unless it is something for something specific. So my coffee mugs I try to do slightly thicker because they insulate the heat a little bit better. So you don't pour some scalding hot coffee into your cup and go to grab it and the mug burns your hand. So that's another consideration that I do. If it is going to be a cooking vessel or something, that I'll consciously try to leave it a little thicker. But I don't think I've ever made anything thicker than 1/2 inch. That's very thick. And I've probably gone down to 1/8 of an inch for a thickness.
Great.
That's kind of some of the things I consider. As well as the overall weight of the vessel. You don't want a vessel that is incredibly heavy. I also try to consider being mindful of the resource. So I'm not using a lot of clay for one vessel. Like I can use the same amount of clay for more than one vessel, just to kind of be respectful for that. So this is another clay that's a little lighter and more gray that I made a few days ago. And I've been letting it kind of stiffen up. This clay I've noticed really likes water and likes moisture, so it takes a long time to dry out. So I let it take its time. I am adding these kind of these raised edges on this form, kind of really elongated shapes to then this one has started to create a design for a corn. I'll eventually make these into corn maidens. I have not made a corn maiden pot in a while. That was one style that my late grandmother, Faye So, was really well known for, and I always admired the shapes that she made, and so I wanted to make another one. One thing that I wanted to talk about with dust and using dry material is that when I first started, I would refine the surface of my vessel. Once it dried, I would sand it and then water wash it, which buff it with a damp sponge. And then I'd stone polish when it's dry. But as potters know, silica dust is like your worst nightmare. So you don't want to be able to breathe that in. So as a technical challenge, because I figured if I started doing this now, long-term, it would really show up in my work or push my work further, is that I polish all when it's leather hard. And so that means I've really become acquainted in different stones and what stage of dryness it works well, because through the drying process, I will polish a piece anywhere from 3 to 8 times to kind of refine the surface. So this is kind of midway through a coffee mug that I'm working on. Another thing I've been considering is the direction that I polish. If I direct polish at an angle, then it creates an inherent motion, a swirl that is subtle in the vessel. So just kind of adding those details rather than just polishing vertical or horizontal. So at this point, because when you polish leather hard, the stone leaves grooves. And so as it starts to stiffen up, the grooves get deeper because the clay has more strength. So I kind of refine the surface a little bit, as well as once the piece is finally polished and finished, there's a slight texture to it, which I've completely fallen in love with, rather than completely flat surface, high polish. That's another thing I consider with how my surface and ultimate function. Sometimes people are scared of pottery. I've never understood it. If it has a smooth surface, people are afraid to drop it. So that's another thing consideration I think about with the ultimate texture of the vessel. If I want someone to not be afraid they'll drop it, I might leave a rough texture on that coffee mug with a corn cob or something like that. As well as I consider that with the weight. You don't want something too light. You want it to have some sort of substance, so you can feel the weight and it's easier to hold on to, rather than if it's so paper thin, it might float away. Or even like it's sitting on a table and the wind blows and just the weight of itself doesn't counteract the wind and it gets blown over. So a lot of the considerations for what I do with thickness and the shape or the weight has all been from kind of a learned experience of what people are comfortable with and how they hold or interact with the vessels that I make, as well as how they function. Are they sturdy on a table? Are they durable? Because having a thickness to a clay, it adds to a durability as well. So usually I usually try to polish in a direction so the motion goes up and clockwise. So there's a consistency with my work, which usually with larger pots, I've got to juggle around to figure out the direction, because there's an inherent, because this is my elbow's fixed here, there's an inherent curve that happens when I polish. So I kind of embrace that to bring that kind of, try to use that to my advantage so that I don't wear myself out with just polishing, because it can be a very laborious task. That's a quick overview of how I create my vessels and I ultimately refine the shape. One more thing I want to talk about, or I guess two more things. That one thing that's really distinct for Navajo pottery is we put a necklace, a traditional raised edge of the vessel. So you can see that I add that to my mug. It has an opening at the handle. I chose the handle just because there's already a break there. This necklace has several significance. One is that we call it its necklace, where once we put it on there, it gives the pot life. And we allow that opening to exist to allow that pot to breathe. There's always also a rule of thumb with your artwork not to close it off from the world, to allow a flaw, to allow some sort of opening, to allow it to breathe. So that's one aesthetic choice that I do, as well as I've been making kind of different design elements or thoughts to make that kind of more, I use this word softly, contemporary idea of the necklace, of how to kind of have that there on the pot, but do it a little differently. Another thing that I do lastly with my pots is I coat them in pinon pitch, which drastically changes the color, but it acts like a natural glaze. It pairs well with the coffee mug because it adds that kind of pinon flavor to your coffee or your tea. Which I love. It brings out the amber colors of all the clay. So that's one thing about that. It looks like we have some questions coming in.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. Jared, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's really wonderful to hear more about your process. And so I'm just going to try to weed through some of these questions here. I do want to ask, Franklin Peters is here with us today, and he is one of our previous participants in this demo series, and he has a few different questions for you, Jared. The first one of which is about your clay sourcing and where you get your clay.
I keep an eye out. So there's some clay spots that other people have shown me. I try to be respectful to each place, because if I always go back to the same place, I don't want to over harvest or kind of exhaust that resource. So it's probably up to 15 places where I get different clays, where they all have different colors, characteristics. They're good for different things. So I try to have a variety on hand, as well as use those clays as slips. If there's one clay that's really good for building, but then one color would be really nice on the outside of the vessel for color. Another thing that I've been teaching courses at Diné College. My students have been awesome this semester and have been bringing in samples from where they are from, which is one of my goals from the course, is that the students will be able to find a clay source from where they're from, rather than we always go back to always all the same places, just to kind of take care of those places, those spots.
Great. Thank you. I would like to hear more about your experience teaching, but I'm gonna focus on some other questions in here for now. So also from Franklin, he's asking about your use of the corn cob and if you use it to polish and make the surface of your pieces smoother, because that's what he does.
I've never thought about that. I've always thought of them as the equivalent of this kind of serrated edge. I've kind of used it on purpose so that if I make a bowl that's like a stew bowl, I'll leave that corn cob like rough in that same kind of spiral direction on the outside, so that you can really grip it with your hand. I've only used the corn cob to in replace to this stage to kind of scrape, or to kind of amplify that texture so that it has a direct, there's a rough texture on the final piece rather than a polished surface.
Cool. There are several different questions along a similar vein of just kind of the state of Diné or Navajo pottery making today, especially in terms of forms and using traditional quote unquote techniques. And you mentioned pine pitch and all that stuff. So can you just speak kind of broadly about the state of Diné ceramic making at the moment?
I've always been surprised that there hasn't been more potters making. A lot of people that make today, there's only a couple that are making that are showing, I guess, in galleries or art shows. Other than that, a lot of people make for, as a community resource, where the traditional vessels that we need for our prayers or our ceremonies and that type of thing. When it comes to function and the state of where I hope it goes is, like, as Navajo people, kind of whatever we make contributes to the definition of what Navajo pottery is. And I want that conversation to be open, especially if, like, what does that mean if we use commercial clay? What if we use a soda kiln or a wood-fired kiln, or we use these techniques we use other places? And, like, whether we like it or not, whatever we make contributes to that definition. And so to kind of be mindful of that and thoughtful of that, because I would argue that as Native potters, especially in the show realm and kind of the museum realm of how our work is talked about, we don't always have control of the narrative of our work, the intention behind our work. And so I think it's really important to be thoughtful on that, so that we can put ourselves in a position to make sure that the narrative of our work is in our own words and our own control.
Absolutely. I think that's an extraordinarily important point. And kind of in the similar vein, can you talk a little bit more about, in the beginning of the presentation, you talked about your hesitancy to use the word traditional versus contemporary. Would you be able to expand a little bit on that?
If I ask somebody from where I'm from what tradition is, I'm going to get a very different definition for what the definitions of what traditional pottery are when you submit a piece for jury. It is a very, like, defined checklist of traditional clay. It's I would say it's very stale or sterile. It's almost like we're reading from a textbook, kind of these anthropological or archaeological, like the verbiage or the wording that we use. And so that's where my criticism comes in, is because with that, those harsh definition, there's a time element that exists in that, where even though the traditional process is more challenging and there is a beauty in the way that we talk about it in those realms, it talks or puts the context of our work in the past, like almost like we are expected to replicate the past. And so then what does that mean as contemporary people? We're making work. If I make a traditional pot today, it is inherently contemporary because it was made today by a living, breathing person. And so I think we need to be a lot more thoughtful of this contemporary, traditional kind of duality that we've put on this medium, because I would argue it's not very appropriate, because we have very drastic different interpretations. And what it comes down to is authenticity, how to authenticate a traditional pot. And sometimes I think that's a little limiting and kind of stands in the way of realness.
Yeah, and who determines what is considered authentic and what is considered traditional? It's often non-native people in those spaces making those determinations and classifications.
Exactly.
Yeah, so thank you for your thoughts on that. So we have a few more technical questions to kind of shift the conversation a little bit about your clay. So we have one question about the use of volcanic basalt as an additive and kind of what that looks like for you.
Yeah, so I use that as a temper. A temper is great for the shrink rate of the pot. So clay has a natural shrink rate, so it helps with the control of that vessel. It helps with handling the flame and the heat of the vessel. Volcanic basalt is this specific source is what my family has used. So it was naturally something to be used. I've also heard that it's great for functional cookware, that it handles heat really well versus sometimes the volcanic ash. But that's all around that I want to do with kind of, that's a lot of research and development to actually test those things, which is high risk.
Yes. So in a similar vein about talking about your clay and your materials, we have a question on if you dry strain or water mix your clay.
I do it all water just to avoid that. So I'll dissolve the clay into a slip and then screen it rather than breaking it up into a powder, just to absorb or to avoid the dust for longevity for my lungs long term, as well as kind of avoid dust in the area that I work and so forth. So I've moved to all of a wet process.
Great. And again, on a similar note, can you talk a little bit about the history of using pine pitch on Diné ceramics and why that is used?
I would have to say I'm unfamiliar with the actual history of it. It's also a good question for the source of the story of the history of where I'm kind of getting that source, whether it's from an anthropological resource or whatnot. But I know that pitch acts as, like, similar to how you have to season a cast iron to work with a cast iron. The clay that we fire in a pit fire ends up being very porous. So sealing it some way to be watertight, that pitch acts in that way, acts as a natural glaze. And I know historically, Naval pottery never really broke into a collector or gallery realm for the longest time. It was very true to the function of them. And I think that's why the pignon pitch had that, as well as I think there's also a crossover with that, the use of that material with our traditional baskets that were used for making those baskets watertight as well. I think there was a connection there.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So let's see here. We have a question that is about well, it's a question about your background just as a Diné person and how important your cultural heritage and background in terms of, from this person asked, how prayers, stories, and songs and pottery making influence your work.
I think it goes hand in hand. I think it's really important. It's like, it's who we are. It's who my family is. And pottery has always had a direct connection to that, whether making tobacco pipes or prayer for myself or other people, that there's always kind of that thought, as well as just like with our prayers and our ceremonies, they're a way to take care of us, take care of yourself or take care of one another. And I see that with pottery has become a way that I take care of myself, just as like an outlet, as well as a livelihood to take care of my family. So it's all connected.
Perfect. So I think that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you, Jared, for your time. And thank you everybody again for your patience with our technical difficulties this morning. Jared, is there anything else that you'd like to share with MIAC audiences before we sign off?
I thank you for joining. Thank you for checking it out. If you have any questions further that you weren't able to ask, please reach out on my social media. I most comment on Instagram, and that's a great place to also see my work, finished work, just demonstration.
Great. All right. Thank you all, and stay tuned for future demos. And thank you, Jared, for spending your morning with us.